Well, friends, we turn again to the wisdom literature of the Hebrew text today for one more week of our series called Living a Good Life. On a tour through the book of Proverbs with a stop last week to tell the story of Esther, we've been trying to assemble the building blocks of a good life, a good name, a good mind, a good community, a good cause. Today, a good practice. It's curious then that we end our series on living a good life all of these weeks following ancient wisdom that offers some priorities and practices for good human living, confronted with a story that deflates any fantasy you and I might have of the moral coherence of the world in which we live. We would love to live in a world where behavior predicts outcome. After all, isn't that the point of living a good life? Do the right thing, make the good choice, be the better person, and in the end, everything will turn out great. Well, that didn't happen for Job. As one commentator points out succinctly, what happens to Job is our worst nightmare. He's a good person who does all the right things and ends up losing everything. His family, his friends, his home, his possessions, even his health. It takes just 35 verses to catapult Job from his perfect life to an ash heap covered in oozing sores, completely alone. This is perhaps not the exact place I would have chosen for us to end this series on living a good life. Maybe even more than you do. I wish we could end up with a predictable formula for success. But as you notice, this series is called Living a Good Life, not Living the Good Life. Too often, organized religion has missed this subtle distinction, and we've been promised if you act a certain way, if you attend church enough, if you give enough money, if you are a good person, well, life is going to turn out sweet. But all of us have been around the block enough to know that this is just not true. Good people experience bad things. Bad people behave badly and are rewarded. Human life is punctuated with pain. It doesn't matter who you are. So maybe it's best that we're ending our consideration of how to live a good life with this story. The story of Job reminds us that living a good life is not about what you get in the end. It's about integrity. It's about doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, no matter what the outcome is. Living a good life means having a good practice. The structure of the book of Job is fairly straightforward. There are two bookends of the story, and in between the bookends, the author of Job created a series of conversations about the question of suffering, a set of dramatic dialogue pieces, if you will. The book of Job isn't meant to be a historical recounting of a cultural time frame or even the biography of one guy who lived a very dramatic life. What inspired the writing of this book was the fact that someone was troubled by the prevalence of suffering all around him. He had learned from an early age the cause of suffering and how to avoid it. But having lived long enough, he was starting to think that the lessons he'd learned growing up, the lessons that suffering and abundance are factors in some huge cosmic math problem, well, that just wasn't true. It did not explain what he saw all around him. Righteous people suffering, wicked people prospering. The cosmic equation turned on its head. So the writer of Job created what is kind of a morality play, this beautiful Hebrew poetry raising some of the most profound questions of human life. To review, Job was the all-star quarterback of the faithful. Homecoming king, most likely to succeed, Job was blameless and upright. He feared God. He turned away from evil. Job's author describes him as someone who was just born with good genetics. But it was more than that. Job actively pursued holiness. He even, one chapter tells us, prayed extra hard for his children just in case they make a foolish mistake and forget to apologize for it. Job had it all covered for himself and for everybody else around him. And by the time we read our passage from chapter 2 this morning, Job has already been through enough soap opera for one life. In chapter 1, he loses his camels, his sheep, quite a bit of property, his servants, and all of his children are killed. One thing after another, pain after pain, disbelief after disbelief, loss after loss, they all happened to Job. And we heard scene 2 this morning, which takes place up in heaven. God opened heaven for an audience with whoever it is that hangs out in heaven waiting for an audience with God. Satan snuck in, and some divine agreement was reached about testing God's servant Job. This time around, Job loses everything he has left, and he's covered in painful sores from his head to his toes. He sits with nothing on a pile of ashes, scraping at his sores, and then his wife gets mad at him. Picture it. A man, exemplary citizen, upstanding and well-off, nice family, long marriage, all gone. Gone. Job has sunk about as low as he can sink. And all he has left is the energy to think about why he is living through so much pain. And God here, well, he seems to let Satan get away with all this. And that right there is enough to give anybody's faith a good hard shaking. Still, the text points out again and again and again. Job persists in integrity. He rejects the advice of his wife to curse God and die because he doesn't deserve what's happening to him. He keeps shouting his questions at the sky because he knows that relationship with God is not a cosmic math problem at all, that God cannot be controlled or manipulated, and that there is so much pain and division and fear in the world. And through it all, God does not leave us. Scholars have written for centuries about how the book of Job was written to answer the question of why good people suffer. But friends, I don't see much of an answer to that question here. What I do see instead is a new way of understanding relationship with God and some encouragement to persist even in the face of pain, injustice, and sorrow. In this story, God does not step in and put an invisible super shield around Job. What God does do is place full confidence in the faith of his servant Job. God says, I believe in you, Job. Human life is full of pain, but you are an active participant in divine relationship, and I believe that that relationship is what ultimately defines your life. Not any of the details, not even the most profound suffering. Liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez calls this a disinterested faith. He says that the only way for you and me to make sense of our suffering and our relationship with God is to develop and cultivate a disinterested faith through his commitment to integrity in all things, a good practice. And Job was doing just that, believing in God without looking for rewards or fearing punishment. No matter what life sends our way, living with an authentic faith born of committed practice will always result in living a good life. John Claypool was a notable speaker, preacher, and pastor. I like his thoughts on this strange way that the practice of living in relationship with God offers the key to living a good life, even in the middle of the most terrible pain. While sitting at the hospital bed of his 10-year-old daughter who was dying from leukemia, Claypool was out of options. None of the treatments that the doctors had tried had worked. And as her life was slipping away, all he could do is sit next to her and hold her hand and weep. It took every ounce of spiritual energy, he wrote, to keep from fainting. Later, he considered the passage from the book of Isaiah that reads, "Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." He notes that this passage reverses the order of what we might expect from relationship with God. Isaiah begins with soaring and ends with walking. Claypool wrote, "Now I am sure that to those looking for the spectacular, this may sound insignificant indeed. Who wants to be slowed to a walk, to creep along inch by inch, just barely above the threshold of consciousness and not fainting? That may not sound like much of a religious experience, but believe me, in the kind of despair where I have been, it is the only form of the promise that fits the situation. When there is no occasion to soar and no place to run, and all you can do is trudge step by step by step, to hear of a help that will enable you to walk and not faint, that's good news. That's good news. Living a good life means having a good practice, remembering over and over again with our words and our very lives that God is God and I am not, and that relationship with God is worth everything we have to give it. So live your lives with a good practice. Tell the truth even when people disregard it. Be kind even when the occasion does not call for it. Demand justice even when it seems so far away. Protest, canvass, vote, even if all the cards are stacked against you. Remember and proclaim God's goodness even when the pain and the fear feel too intense. And keep walking even when it feels like you'll never be able to fly.